Hi, I'm Bill Crystal. Welcome back to Conversations. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Jason Furman, a long career of public service as an economist and more broadly a public policy practitioner with a broad perspective, served in the Clinton administration, and then deputy director of the National Economic Council for President Obama at the height of the financial crisis, or I guess at the height of at least getting us out of the financial crisis. But it was also, I think you were also an advisor to candidate Obama in 2008 at the height of the crisis, and then chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in President Obama's second term. And much more important than all of that, of course, now teaching Ec 10, Economics 10, the huge introductory course at Harvard, which you have many impressive predecessors who taught that. And I guess it's become wildly popular. Is it like half of Harvard takes the course or something?
Yeah, we have about half the students in the class, and I think everyone should know economics, so we're going for all of them.
That's good. I'll have to talk to you sometime about all the young Harvard graduates I meet here in D.C. Maybe they're the ones who skipped the course, though. So anyway, it's great to have you, Jason, and thanks for taking the time to join us. And let's just get right to it. Just for the record, it's March 21st, so in case something changes radically in the next day or weeks or months, how could that happen? Just so people know when we're talking. And I want to talk, more broadly, obviously, about where we are. In the perspective of the last few years or even a few decades and where we're going. But we can't not begin with the current little crisis we're having, a little financial crisis, banking crisis. So say a word about that. Is it a little blip, or is it a big deal, or where in between of those is it? And why? What's behind it?
It's always hard to tell in the middle of these things. It's happened much faster than the last financial crisis. It spread from one tiny bank to one much larger bank to an even larger bank in Switzerland, all within days. And last time it took sort of 6 months between each of the major shoes dropping. But I do think our financial regulatory system is better. It's not as good as we thought it was, but it's better than it was back then. That our responses are correspondingly faster too than they were the last time around. And so I'm somewhat optimistic that this can be contained, but, not at all certain in that optimism.
Do you buy the argument that the speed is sort of related to just the speed of everything these days, including especially social media and information, and the ability? Bank runs were always fast, but they're now super fast. Is that something to that, you think? Or?
I think there may be something to that. I mean, there was like the old one bank in the town, and you'd see the person and they'd talk to the other person. News in town spread pretty quickly.
Right.
And Silicon Valley Bank was a small town bank. It happens that small town has hundreds of billions of dollars. And so not exactly it's a wonderful life town. But I think it's possible that the technology and the smartphones are spreading it faster, but I'm not sure.
So all in all, a little bit of a rocky patch, but basically a year from now we'll be chugging along as we were with the same problems and challenges, or a little more chance of sort of this being a big disruption to where we were.
Look, I think the big picture, when the Fed started raising rates by 75 basis points a meeting, just a speed of rate increases that we haven't seen for 40 years, lots of people said something would break in the financial system. The Fed never said, oh, don't worry, nothing's going to break. They said, if something breaks, we have the tools to clean up the mess, and we're going to use our interest rates to control inflation, and we're going to use our other tools, like lending facilities and the like, to control any fallout from it. If you had told me a year ago the only thing that was going to break was this would have been almost towards the positive end of my expectations. I thought bigger stuff and worse stuff might happen with rates rising as quickly as they did. So, sometimes I think it's useful to think back to what you yourself might have expected, a year ago, and how does the present compare to that? And yeah, we're in a big mess, but we could have been in an even bigger mess.
Yeah, It's a great slogan, a good presidential campaign slogan.
That was like Obama's big message in 2009, 10, and 11 was like, oh yeah, sure, the unemployment rate's 9, but it might have been 12.
Right. It was mostly true, right? So, but look, that's so interesting because I very much agree that people have had a sort of they had a very complacent attitude towards having zero interest rates for a long, long time, and then a sort of weirdly complacent attitude, I think, to the fact that we could just hike them pretty massively, you'd say, and I mean, I'm not saying it was wrong, but just, very rapidly and steeply, and that wouldn't break things. So, I mean, say a word, stepping back one more step. I mean, how does the whole, I mean, but they had to hike rates, right? They had no choice, so.
Yeah. Oh, look, I think the Fed got behind the curve. So I think the problem is if 2 years ago they were making it much clearer that rates were going to go up faster, then there would have been a little bit more preparation in the system, and they wouldn't have had to raise rates as quickly as they did. I don't kid myself, though, that lots of banks still might have made the wrong choices and been overly optimistic and whatever else. I mean, and people like to castigate policymakers. People point to all the ways the Fed has gotten its forecasts wrong. The Fed has made this mistake. The Fed has made that mistake. In December of 2021, I got a mortgage from JP Morgan for the interest rate a bit above 2%. JP Morgan and Jamie Dimon had a really bad inflation forecast in December 2021. If they had any idea what was coming with interest rates or inflation, they wouldn't have written that mortgage to me. So this is not just the Fed misunderstanding the economy. There was a widespread on the part of the private sector and people with a lot of money at stake misunderstanding of the economy going on as well.
And I suppose, to be fair, we were still getting out of the pandemic then, or had just come out maybe, and it was not crazy in the middle of the pandemic to not think that, to be much more concerned with preventing a massive recession or depression than alerting people to the fact that rates would have to go up soon. So I suppose that made it harder, right? The fact that we had zero interest rates for a long time, then massive deficits with Trump, and then, which were maybe not necessary given that we were already doing decently economically, but then the pandemic, which required pretty massive fiscal stimulus and loose monetary policy, I guess, or correct me again if I'm wrong. So, I mean, they have navigated, to be fair to the policymakers, just to pick up on your theme, they've navigated a pretty turbulent and somewhat unprecedented waters here in the last 10 years, no?
Oh, definitely unprecedented. The COVID shock is like nothing we've ever seen before in terms of just literally in 100 years, we hadn't seen this many countries in the world have negative growth simultaneously. We haven't seen anything, this deep in terms of how quickly the economy plunged and the like. The fiscal response was also just unprecedentedly large, 25% of GDP. We've never done anything like that with the exception of World War II. But in terms of responding to an economic or emergency or natural disaster, nothing on that scale. You then ended up in 2022 getting the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the associated increases in commodity prices. That wasn't unprecedented. That's the sort of thing you have every 20 or 30 years. You get a commodity price shock like that. So, and all of that happening at once. So, yeah, it was a very difficult thing to navigate, a very difficult thing to predict. Broadly speaking, I think too little was done in the global financial crisis. And as a result, the unemployment rate was too high for too long. And I have my views as to who's at fault and who's not at fault, and we could get into that. But regardless, that was the output. That's what happened. I think this time we did too much. I'd probably rather have the error of too much rather than too little. But I do think there is a happier medium between too much and too little, which is sometimes called just right.
And say a word about either one, if you wish, but it's particularly the more recent too much, because I feel like, well, I'm just curious. So was it obvious that we were doing too much, or when did it become obvious, and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, part of what happened was the unemployment rate in April went up to basically 15% of April 2020.
2020, right.
And people were like, wow, everything is falling apart. And they started forecasting that by the end of the year, the unemployment rate might be 20%. You look at all the forecasts, Congressional Budget Office and the like, they thought it was actually going to get worse from there. And what happened was it got better from there. In fact, starting the very next month, the unemployment rate dropped, and it dropped rather quickly. Now, the economy was still in quite bad shape in the end of 2021, but it was in much less bad shape than people had expected. And so what I think happened was there was a perception of what needed to be done that didn't adjust as quickly as the economy adjusted. You sort of formed your idea, oh, here's what we need to do because the unemployment rate's 15 rising to 20. And then you stick with that mindset, even though the unemployment rate is now below 10 and falling. And so that the economy getting less bad very quickly relative to people's expectations, I think policymakers are behind the curve on that. Now, what I was doing in the fall of 2021 was I'd come out with actually a bipartisan plan over the summer with Glenn Hubbard, an economist who had been chair of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Bush. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how you figure out the right size for one of these plans. And every month I kept updating it based on the new data, and the right size for a plan kept going down in a sort of surprising way. At first it was like 3 trillion, and then it was 2 trillion, and then it was 1.5 trillion. They ended up between December and March doing 2.8 trillion. So I do think, based on the numbers that were available at the time, the numbers I was calculating and giving to people in the transition, it was knowable that you didn't need to do as much as they were doing. And frankly, the numbers they picked, the $2,000 check, who came up with that idea, Donald Trump, wasn't like a set of economists toiling away in a corner running equations. Donald Trump blurted that out. Then Nancy Pelosi thought it was a good political thing to join, and Joe Biden thought it was a good political thing to join. So none of this really reflected technocratic economics. Not that fiscal policy ever does reflect technocratic economics.
And I suppose you're teaching at the Kennedy School. I mean, if there's one thing you kind of predict based on just history of public policy responses, they're going to always be slightly fighting the last war and slightly lagging the latest data, right? And I mean, so in a sense, maybe it's not that much of a criticism to say they were a little behind the curve. You just sort of, I mean, you pay some price for it, but it's going to happen quite a lot still, I think.
Yeah, and that's also what happened in the financial crisis is we were looking at the economic data that was coming in, and I can't remember the exact numbers anymore, but it might have said, in October and November, 400,000 jobs lost. And that was really big. Like a year later, they're like, oh, wait, we went back and reran the numbers. That month, there were actually 800,000 jobs that were lost, not 400,000 jobs. The growth decline in the fourth quarter of the year, the subsequent revisions doubled the magnitude of that decline. So we were looking at data that just was inaccurately less bad than the truth was. And you saw the same thing. You had people who were really in favor of big government, in favor of fiscal stimulus in the month of November saying we should do a huge, enormous, giant thing, $300 to $500 billion. And, that was a reasonable thing to think then. A month later, you needed twice as much because the hole was just getting bigger that much faster. So yeah, when things are moving, you're always going to be a little bit behind the curve. And yeah, I have a certain amount of charity towards that mistake.
I'm just curious, since you mentioned that. I mean, so it's been 15 years, I guess, it's hard to believe, since 2008. I mean, apart from getting things right and, having better data and being a little more nimble, which are not trivial public policy recommendations, anything fundamental that you think you've learned or we should have learned from these 15 years about sort of economic policy, fiscal, monetary, or just overall the economy as a thing?
I mean, I have a little bit more affection for trying to get some of these policies to be done by formula rather than by discretion. So, for example, states need to balance their budgets no matter what. And that's a terrible thing to have to do in a recession. It can deepen the recession, take assistance away from people when they most need it, and the like. And so I like the idea of when the unemployment rate is high in a state, they get more money from the federal government. When it's low, they get less money from the federal government. And, if we had done that in the last crisis, states would have gotten a lot of money rather than what happened with policymakers. They got tired of giving money, and so they stopped doing it. Conversely, this time, the money would have been cut off a lot sooner because those unemployment rates came down and they wouldn't have gotten this big bonanza that led states like Massachusetts to have nothing better to do with the money than to send me a large refund check.
Yeah, that does seem like a non-optimal use of taxpayer money. I'm gonna agree with you on that. Now, that is interesting about the formulas, though, because that's been such a sort of it's an interesting. Of course, policymakers don't like that for obvious reasons, right?
Right. And even on monetary policy, I mean, it traditionally was a conservative view. John Taylor was the economist most associated with the idea that you should run monetary policy by a rule, just replace all these people deliberating with a formula. And liberals like myself were like, oh, the geniuses in government, they can do a much better job than this formula. Look at all these different quirks in the formula, and it would have understood this and it would have missed that. I want the judgment of the great people in government. I'm not ready to turn monetary policy over to a formula, but placing more weight on it, having them regularly report what the formula says, explain in detail why they've used their judgment to do something different than the formula, put a little bit more weight on what the formula tells you. I have more affection for that than I had 5 years ago.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, since you, as a sort of liberal economist, have given a sort of conservative lesson, maybe I'll offer, as a sort of conservative, one liberal lesson. I'm curious whether you think it's right, though, which is that I feel like the criticism of inflation, which obviously they were a little slow on in the Fed, and maybe other things, of course, that the Fed doesn't control, contributed to that. You should talk about that for a minute, too. Is a little, but the idea that that's the only thing that's happened in the last 2 years, which is kind of the Republican and to some degree conservative talking point, is a little ridiculous. I mean, and is it? I mean, it's bad, and we should talk for a minute about if inflation is peculiarly a bad price to pay for other things. But we do have, non-trivially, I think, low unemployment and real economic growth. I think real economic growth still, and avoiding various bad things. Am I too kind to? I don't know. I sort of feel like the attack, the inflation hawks have been overdoing it a little, refusing to acknowledge that there were some benefits from what I guess was being a little too slow to tighten on the Fed's part.
Right. So I'm torn on this question because I think there's what economists think people should think about inflation and what people actually think about inflation are different. That when I teach my class, I go through the problems of inflation, and one of them is what's called menu costs and shoe leather costs. You have to print new menus more often, and you keep a smaller amount of cash in your wallet because you're afraid it'll be inflated away. So you have to go to the ATM more often, and you run out. You wear out the leather on your shoes. You try to add up.
That's an example you're going to have to abandon in a year or two when none of your students know what cash is,
Exactly. And you add up menu costs and shoe leather costs, and they're really quite small. Then you say there's the general inconvenience of a changing yardstick, and that's hard to measure and quantify, and certainly, it's unnecessary to have unless there's some other benefit. And then you say inflation has big winners and losers. So surprise inflation helps debtors, and it hurts creditors. And there are probably tens of millions of people in our economy who have benefited from the inflation. Maybe it was a business that was able to raise prices more. Maybe a worker was able to get a bigger raise. Maybe it's someone whose mortgage is now worth 10% less, and they have to pay back 10% less than they used to. But there are not tens of millions of people who think they benefited from inflation. In fact, I'm not sure there are tens of people who think they've benefited from inflation. And so it has these winners and losers. The losers are very aware of their losses. The winners are completely oblivious to their gains. And so then as a policymaker, do you want to sort of make people happy? Or do you want to sort of do what you think is in their economic and financial interest? And that's, that to me is not obvious. So yeah, if you told me 3.5% unemployment and 6% inflation, and people are less happy today than they were when we had 8 or 9% unemployment and 1.5% inflation, I'd think people were, I wouldn't sort of fully understand people, but I think you probably do need to some degree to meet people where they are and do policy in part based on their perception, not just what you think their perception ought to be.
And I also think there was the example of the 70s, which I actually remember as being in college and grad school, and you're too young to remember, but it's nonetheless memorialized, as it were, in the national consciousness, which is somehow inflation is scary because it kind of gets out of control and no one knows what to do about it, and everything gets eroded, whether it's your paycheck or your savings. I mean, I do think it's a sort of psychology of inflation that I don't know, feels like it's particularly unnerving to people, maybe more than a standard kind of recession where unemployment goes up a couple of points.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I remember being an annoying teenager, or maybe younger than a teenager. My grandparents would say, like, "Oh, remember when hot dogs used to cost 5 cents and now they cost $1?" I'd be like, "Grandpa, how much were you paid back when hot dogs cost 5 cents?" And he's like, "Well, I was paid a lot less, but I've worked really hard and I've gotten raises and I've earned all my extra pay, and they just keep taking it away from me with the higher prices." And I grasped then that the same process that was resulting in his raise was also raising the price of hot dogs. That's not the way people think of it. They earned their money, and the inflation is this terrible thing that, Joe Biden or Jay Powell or maybe the Republicans did to them.
But a wage, price spiral inflation really isn't good, right? I mean, it's not just that it's psychologically hard for people to come to grips with.
Oh, yeah. And I think and in some sense, the other answer on inflation is that it's too early to tell. If we can get inflation down painlessly, then I think we'll look back on this one way. If we have a big recession and we still have high inflation, and then we need a second recession to get the inflation down, I think we'll think of it another way. And, people use the word wage price spiral. I actually don't like that. I think it's usually used as a straw man term to dismiss a view. You caricature it of like, oh, you think a wage price spiral. So you think we're going to have wages going up 4, so prices are going to go up 6, so wages are going to go up 10, so prices are going to go up to 100, and then it's all $1 million, and that's not happening. You're an idiot. There's no wage price spiral. So that's why I don't like using the word. I use the word wage price persistence, which I think of as both of them get stuck at a high level. So wages are growing 5% a year, prices are growing 4% a year, and that happens sort of year after year with one feeding the other. So it doesn't spiral up, but it can stay high for a prolonged period of time.
And that does do damage and has all kinds of distortions then to previous expectations in terms of prices and debt and assets, right? I mean, it's not just that, as you could say, well, look, if prices go up 5% and wages go up 5%, it's sort of your grandfather's situation and everyone should just chill out. I remember people saying that a bit in the 70s, and then by the end of the 70s, people were not saying that,
Yeah. I mean, certainly we know we don't want rising inflation. Like, I think everyone could agree that if it keeps rising, that's a problem. If it stays high, high inflation tends to be variable inflation. You look across countries, there are not a lot of countries that have a very stable 10% inflation rate. If you have a 10% inflation rate, some years you have 5, some years you have 15, and that instability can create all sorts of problems. And so, high inflation really is unstable inflation. But again, I think so much of this depends on, can we get the inflation out of the system? I'm a little bit skeptical that we're going to be able to get it out very painlessly. But the Fed does have decades of credibility built up. And so, I think it has a fighting shot at doing it. It just isn't where I'd bet my money.
Yikes. And are you skeptical because the Fed was late and it's just too built in now, or because it's not, it's caused by things that are not susceptible to Fed action, such as, supply chains and labor supply and so forth?
Yeah, that supply chains and labor supply have been part of the story. I think they've been pretty widely overstated the degree to which they were part of the story. So I'm not saying they're not anything. They have mattered. Let me just give you an example. If you gave everyone in the country $1 million, you would observe a ton of supply chain problems. Ports would be backed up. There wouldn't be enough truckers to deliver goods. There'd be shortages at the stores. All sorts of things would break in the supply chain. And that isn't because supply got worse, it's because demand went up. As I teach it in my class, that would be the demand curve shifted, the supply curve stayed the same, but you moved up the supply curve. And you could see that because the quantity would go up and the price would go up. I think that's a lot of what we saw. The ports, for example, were all over our TVs for a while. Look at all the problems in the ports. The only problems the ports had was that they were processing 20% more stuff than they were prior to COVID. It was the biggest 2-year jump we'd had in a long time in pork processing, but people wanted to buy even more than that. So they just couldn't keep up with the demand. So I do think this has been more about demand than supply from the very beginning, with the exception of the oil part of it. I think that really was supply. But with the exception of the oil part, I think it's more demand than supply. I think that's within the control of the Fed. And yeah, I think that has a persistence to it and might be hard to wring out of the system.
So you're a little less optimistic about a soft landing, I think, than some of your friends in the administration at least say they are.
Yes, I am less optimistic about a soft landing. And and just look at the last couple of recessions, not counting COVID, which is a weird different one. The 3 recessions before that, the inflation rate fell by between 0.9 and 1.9 percentage points. So even a recession just doesn't lower the inflation rate by that much. And so, I think it's going to be hard to get the inflation down. But, we were talking before, all these shocks are huge and unprecedented. We're still living with them. And so I do think you have to, one lesson in the last 2 years is definitely more humility, wider confidence intervals. And no one loves a two-handed economist, but they don't love a economist that gets everything wrong too. So right. I think you have to be honest about your uncertainty.
And what would sort of an unsoft landing, but not disaster, look like? I mean, in sort of just in terms of unemployment and inflation and length of time it takes to work through that.
Right. I mean, there's the hard landing that gets the job done. So the unemployment rate goes up, the inflation rate goes down, and then you can grow after it and everything is fine again. That's not ideal, but that's not the end of the world. When I've run models, I get unemployment rates like 6.5% for 2 years to get inflation down to 2%, but that it's also really nonlinear. If you're willing to have inflation only go down to 2.5%, you need much less unemployment than if you need to get yourself all the way to 2%. The further you're going, the more the cost rises. And so, if you want to reset the inflation target to 3%, which by the way would be fine with me, then you don't need that much unemployment to get there. That's the hard landing. The scarier scenario is what I'd call an incomplete hard landing, or maybe even full-blown stagflation, where you have a recession and you come out of the recession with an inflation rate still, say, north of 3.5%. And then, what do? That's a non-trivial chance of that happening. And that's, to me, the scariest of the possibilities here.
And when did these, putting on our sort of political economy hat and also, politics hat here of 2024 and so forth, like when did these things, I want to come back actually to banking and some of the other economic issues, but when does this happen again, who knows, but in general, what time frame are we looking at in these two different scenarios?
Right. I mean, when I try to think about the world, I try to think probabilistically and break it down into a set of conditional questions. So the first is, if you tell me the unemployment rate is going to be 3.5%, what do I think inflation will be? If you tell me it's going to be 5%, what do I think it'll be? If you tell me it's 6.5%, what do I think inflation will be? Then I ask sort of, why might I think the unemployment rate would be 3.5 or 5 or 6 or something like that? I find that first question, the what is inflation conditional on unemployment, it's not like I can give you a guaranteed perfect answer, but I find it somewhat easier than forecasting what the unemployment rate will be. At this point, there's the banking, where even if the banking crisis is solved, it will still be a contraction in credit. And no one has any idea how big that contraction in credit would be. It could easily be big enough to slip us into a recession, or it could, or it may not be. I think monetary policy is going to keep raising rates as long as they need to before inflation comes down. So I do think there is, unless you have this soft landing, which I think is unlikely, there's a recession out there. I used to think the recession was more like second half of this year, first half of next year. but the banking crisis may move that forward. From a political perspective, I think the Biden administration would have probably benefited the most from a recession happening on November 8th, 2022. And to some degree, trying to keep things moving along. You can understand it in the short run, but it might, it might push some of the harm and damage out and make it a little bit more costly to solve the whole inflation issue.
I mean, what do I know? But a banking crisis, constraining or debt, credit rather, combined with Fed hikes, that sounds fairly recessionary to me. I mean, I don't know. Have we ever had that without a recession? I mean, those two things together.
Yeah, I mean, we had the savings and loan sort of went on for a while before you got the recession, but I agree. I think that banks are going to be supervised more carefully. They themselves are going to be more nervous. Their boards are going to be asking harder questions. They're all going to be lending a lot less, especially small businesses, real estate, some of the sectors that are most dependent on small and medium-sized banks and that don't have access to, say, private credit through the private equity firms. So I'm not that worried about the large businesses and their access to credit. But it's going to it's going to, be reduced a lot for other sectors in the economy.
It's funny, I haven't thought about the S&L crisis in a long time, but I was in the first Bush White House, George H.W. Bush White House. I was Vice President, Chief of Staff, and no one cared about my opinions, and I had no informed opinions, God knows, about what to do about the S&L crisis. I always had the impression that the Bush administration handled that quite responsibly and pretty well, actually, that it could have been a really major problem. I mean, people forget how big a chunk of the banking system that was, and they worked it out. And Michael Boskin and I guess Richard Breeden and those people, and we got a bit of recession in 91, 92. Not, I think, mostly because of maybe partly because of S&Ls, and partly just because there've been a lot of years of growth before, I suppose. And the Fed did raise rates, as I recall. And it's like no good deed goes unpunished, right? We kind of came through all that reasonably well. I think one might say, by the time Bill Clinton took over, we were coming out of it all. But I don't know. Is that fair? And is that generally true that you get no credit for the, averting it, having a mildly bad outcome and averting a real disaster, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I think it was handled reasonably well. Now, it did actually, when you look back, it cost a decent amount to handle the S&L. The money was worth it. It was worth it for the sake of the economy. So that's not a criticism.
No, we were shocked by those numbers at the time. Of course, now in the modern post-2008 world, they're like they're rounding errors, but they were big at the time.
I'm not positive in this case. I am positive. It actually ended up costing more than TARP and the financial rescue because we actually got a return on the financial rescue, and we got a lot of that money back in the way that we didn't from the S&Ls. Again, this is not a criticism of policy. It's what needed to be done. But yeah, and then, of course, there was the growth number right before the election in 1992 was pretty disappointing. And then right after the election, it got revised up. 0% chance of mischief on the part of the government statisticians. It's very standard for numbers to be revised up or down a lot. But yeah, the economy was doing better in the run-up to the 1992 election than people looking at the economic data at the time would have known.
Yeah, and the budget deal, which did end up reducing the deficit, or getting us on a path to a reduced deficit. But at the time, it was a very high deficit, partly, I think, because of S&L. And the military spending hadn't come down yet. And so you sort of looked like a bad situation in 92. I remember that part politically, vividly. Anyway, your account from a political economy point of view is not entirely heartening for the Biden administration. I guess they could prepare people for it a little bit. And again, I am struck how much people take it for granted that we're going to get through, the biggest financial crisis in 70 years, a pandemic, as you say, a war. I left that out earlier. The largest war in Europe in 80 years. Is that right? Yeah, just about 80 years. And various other things. And basically sort of be okay, I think you'd say, in the big picture, from 30,000 feet. We're not in the 30s here. But of course, no one gets credit for that, whether it's the Obama administration or I suppose maybe the Trump administration deserves a little. I don't know about that, and then the Biden administration. It is. I don't even know how one can reset the public's expectations, in that respect.
Right. I mean, everything you said was right. There are things on the other side of the ledger.
Yes.
We're going into this with a lot of open jobs, for example, employers looking to hire. You're going into this with corporate balance sheets being pretty healthy, individual balance sheets being pretty healthy. People are borrowing more than they were borrowing a year ago, but they're still borrowing less relative to their income, which is the only way to measure borrowing, than they were prior to the crisis. And so the healthier balance sheets, some of the momentum of demand, and then just, the oil prices coming down, and the like. So there are things going in both directions, but I agree on balance, they're moving in the wrong direction.
Yeah, and I was almost trying to make more of a point about perceptions almost, though. You get no credit for the sort of, as I say, avoiding disaster over the last 14, 15 years. And what really could have been disasters more than once, 2 or 3 times. And instead you get blamed for things. But on the positive point, I guess, so stepping back maybe even from 10,000 feet to 30,000 feet, I mean, am I wrong to think that basically all in, the U.S. economy is in pretty good shape? I mean, that, we went through a very bad financial crisis and didn't go into the 30s. We've got problems, but, we're still innovating and we're still productive and we have low unemployment for all the complaints about the workforce and all these sorts of things. God knows there are things we could do to improve things. We should talk about that for a minute, maybe immigration and stuff. But I don't know. I mean, am I too complacent to say that, all in all, pretty impressively strong economy, or do you think that it's more all in all pretty rickety economy that we're seeing all kinds of fissures in and we should be more worried?
Right. Well, we've been talking a lot about the current moment. I think of the things that was in the list you just gave, the productivity part is far and away the most important. That will be what determines, what living standards are like, 15, 20 years from now. The other two are the employment rate and inequality. Inequality, by the way, has been sort of stable recently. In fact, it's been getting better in the last couple of years. But the big increases in inequality happened really before the year 2000, not after the year 2000, especially if you look after taxes and transfers. So we have been sort of growing together a bit more recently than I think a lot of people appreciate. Employment rates are quite high, as you said. The one big question mark and worry in all of that is productivity. And here you see this disconnect. You can read headlines about ChatGPT and nanobots and personalized medicine and CRISPR and all this unbelievably cool stuff. And then you can look at the way economists measure productivity, which is the amount of output per hour, or there's a fancier concept that you can use too that's similar to that. And you don't see that productivity growth being that high. And so, to me, who's right? The technologists in Silicon Valley who are like, all this stuff is super cool, or the economists who are like, well, when we measure it, it doesn't add up to a lot. Not always on the side of the economists, but on this one, I think I am. And I think the way to square that circle is it requires extraordinary amounts of innovation just to push the ball forward a little bit. We mechanized the production of, wheat and corn and cotton a long time ago. It takes the latest advances in robotics and artificial intelligence to mechanize the picking of strawberries and blueberries. So it's like an enormous technological accomplishment to have a robot that can pick a strawberry or blueberry because they're soft fruit, but it just doesn't add that much to GDP. Similarly with cancer, we're still making progress on cancer, which is amazing because the easy things we already know we know how to cut it out, we know how to zap it, we know how to poison it. Those are all the easy things. So how do we make progress? Well, we find like one very particular genetic signature for cancer and a treatment for exactly that genetic signature. And it's amazing. It takes unbelievable technology to do that, but it might be a cancer that only, 1 out of 1,000 people have. And so I think we're seeing, just this extraordinary innovation that's amazingly pushing the ball forward. It just isn't pushing it as much forward as the much simpler innovations we had in the past. And that's my deeper, longer run fear that, we'll still be thinking and worrying about whether what I just said was true or not true 5 or 10 years from now, long after we've forgotten the banking crisis.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I guess, is there also some truth, I've read this somewhere, that these innovations, technological breakthroughs, they are very dramatic, but the actual economic effect often isn't felt for 10, 20, 30 years, that they take a while to work through to having actually major systemic effects on major parts of the economy, as opposed to sort of, wow, look what we can do, as you said, with this, in medicine, for example.
Right.
So could we be making a lot of breakthroughs that we will only see the rewards of 5 or 10 years from now?
That's an argument that's out there. I think it's certainly possible. And by the way, in my class, I present both of these, and I say I'm agnostic between the two of them. There are only a few examples of that technological delay. One of them is electrification, which is just the ability to generate electricity doesn't do a whole lot of good without transmission lines and light bulbs, and even reorganizing the way factories produce things, et cetera, et cetera. So electricity is the best example. People used computers as an example for a while because it took a while before the advances showed up in the data. The problem is they only showed up in the data from around 1995 to 2005, and then they stopped showing up in the data. So I think that at this point is now a less good example. But yeah, I mean, ChatGPT right now, it's so far reduced my productivity because I waste a bunch of time, creating like limericks about monetary policy. But, at some point it's going to help me write better titles for papers, or flesh out the middle of something I'm doing, or write some code, or whatever else. And it's going to become, a real, I think, productivity increaser.
Yeah, I wouldn't have picked that necessarily as the most obvious productivity increaser, since it also has such a fantastic opportunity, as you suggest, for wasting time. But I don't know. When people say like air travel, and people learned how to fly airplanes long before you had massive air travel, and assuming massive air travel has increased, I don't know, has been of benefit to the economy, which I suppose may not be the case, but, it sort of was a delayed function. I sort of wonder whether that couldn't happen in things like medicine, that transforming a breakthrough at Sloan Kettering for, an experiment with 42 patients is transforming that into a massive economically possible cure or treatment. There's got to be some lag there.
Yeah. Oh, look, the pessimistic version I had before of the good ideas are harder to find. I have sort of 75% weight on that, and we're going to figure it all out and it's going to transform everything with a lag, I have 25% weight on. Those are my true weights. In class, I tell them I'm 50-50 because I don't want to bias them, but I'll tell you the truth. Just hopefully the students won't listen to this.
I just hopefully
I don't want to scare them and upset them.
And it's good for them to learn that what people say in class isn't always 100% of the truth, and there's a little bit of,
to be clear, what I say in class is, insofar as it's not what I think, it's because I'm shading towards the consensus, not towards the deliberate untruth.
Plus, you don't.
I don't think my job is to share.
You don't want to demoralize. No, but you don't want to demoralize them. That's a good thing. What about immigration? I mean, are there things that we're not doing that we should be doing? Sort of it sounds like in a lot of these areas, and this is one of the great virtues of economics. Is why I always recommend people study it. Is that you learn there are trade-offs, and these are not simple choices. And as you say, things are probabilistic and so forth. It does feel to me like, maybe I'm wrong about this, that immigration is one of those areas where there's not much of a trade-off. I mean, it's like almost unambiguously having more immigrants, certainly skilled, but I would actually personally say almost of all kinds, would be a benefit to the economy and to the country, in my view. But that's not obviously a universal view.
Yeah. I think from an economic perspective, immigration is the number one thing we could do for growth in our country by a large margin. I don't think anything else comes close to it. And it operates through two channels. One is just a larger labor force. Our labor force would be shrinking in the United States without immigrants. Because of immigrants, our labor force is growing, and a shrinking labor force can be sort of a problematic, difficult thing. But then more importantly is innovation and productivity. And you have, with the high-skilled ones, it's obvious. They bring all sorts of ideas. And by the way, the evidence is native-born Americans are much more likely to come up with new ideas and new discoveries when they're working with people from foreign countries that have come to the United States. On the less skilled end of the spectrum, you should remember the main debate is not, are we going to bring another 10 million people to our country? It's how are we going to handle the 10 million that are already here? And, business leaders always talk about uncertainty and how it gets, uncertainty's terrible, uncertainty, we can't do this, uncertainty, we can't do that. Imagine the uncertainty these people face now. Now imagine an economy where they can start a business, move to a different job, move to a different place, allocate their talent in the way that would contribute most to themselves and to the economy. I have no doubt that reducing uncertainty for the population that's already here would also be productivity enhancing.
And you've been in the White House and in the political side of political economy. I mean, how depressed are you or fatalistic are you about the political difficulty or impossibility of breaking the gridlock on immigration?
Yeah, it's such a tough issue. I mean, even notwithstanding my point that it's the number one thing you can do for growth, but that isn't just my opinion. We had in the G20, I think it was in 2015, a process where all 20 countries submitted their growth strategies to the World Bank, IMF, and OECD, which objectively quantified what they would do for growth. And they found they would do, the U.S. growth plan was the biggest of any of them because we had immigration as part of ours, and none of the other 19 countries had immigration reform in their growth plans. So notwithstanding, this is the biggest economic thing that we proposed during the Obama administration. I was at the meetings, but no one cared what I had to say. And they shouldn't have cared what I had to say because they were figuring out how to navigate some incredibly difficult political set of deals and trade-offs of this group versus that group. I had no insight. I had nothing to offer to that. My view was very simple, like more is better. They knew that already. They didn't need that. They needed the politics. And, George W. Bush made a sincere run at it. He failed. I truly believe Paul Ryan wanted to do a deal with us on it. We weren't able to do that. Biden has, maybe it's been politically what he had to do. I don't know. But economically and morally, it's disappointing to me that he has not done nearly as much of a reversal of President Trump's immigration policies as I would have hoped. So, yeah, this is a really hard one.
I mean, in retrospect, and I think, wrong about this at the time, I wasn't much involved, but in 2013, the failure of the Obama, the deal that President Obama supported, that John McCain was and Chuck Schumer were key parts of, and Marco Rubio, that passed the Senate. Everyone's forgotten this, like 68-32 or something like that. It wasn't like obvious suicide, and then got stopped by the Republicans in the House, even though they probably could have won a floor vote. But they had the Hastert rule, which meant they weren't going to move something. Boehner felt he couldn't move it unless he had the majority of the conference behind him. I mean, that probably, I wonder in retrospect whether that was a bigger deal than I at least realized at the time. I mean,
I do wonder if you ran history 10 times in a row, 3 of those 10 times, would you have figured out some way to get immigration reform through under Obama? Because you did have the Senate there, and you had the Speaker of the House there, and you had a president that was very willing to be much tougher on border security in exchange for getting the other parts done. So it did seem like there's some places where there's irreconcilable differences. Just the two parties have just a totally different opinion on the issue. There's no way to come together. Here, I just feel there must have been some way to solve the jigsaw puzzle. And, it saddens me that it wasn't solved.
Before we let you get back to teaching Ec 10, we should discuss, I think, debt and deficit for a minute, since we've all put it out of our minds for the last decade or so, I guess. But I'm old enough to remember when that was kind of a major concern of serious people, and how proud the Clinton administration was, not without merit, that we were like having surpluses in the last year of Clinton and all that. So, is there something? What about debt and deficit? How much of a risk is that, especially in the context of rising interest rates?
Right. So I've been on every side of this issue, and I'd like to think that reflects the fact that I update my views based on the data, and I'm not doctrinaire, but it's possible that I'm just, inconsistent and incoherent. So yeah, I thought I sort of liked the deficit reduction we did under President Clinton, and used to write some of the little, talking points or chapters or whatever saying how great it was. Then I became unconcerned about the debt, and now I am somewhere, in between. The rational version of this is that what we care about is not debt, but debt service. That debt service was really quite high in the mid to late 80s through the mid 90s. And so it made sense that policymakers were doing deficit reduction, both for fiscal sustainability, because the government had this big cost, and also because the high interest rates were getting in the way of capital formation, home ownership, and the like. 5 years ago, the problem for capital formation in this country was not that interest rates were too high. Interest rates were crazy, crazy low. And so I thought debt and deficits just had no place in our worry. Interest rates have come back up. Now, they're not as high as they were in real interest rates, adjusted for inflation, as they were in the late 80s or early 90s. But they have risen. As I look at it going forward, we have a couple forcing events. The individual tax cuts passed under President Trump expire in 2025. Medicare runs out of money in the late 2020s, and Social Security runs out of money in the early 2030s. We have to sort of deal with at least two of those three. If we do gimmicks to get through all three and borrow money and do accounting tricks, then I think we face a problem. If we deal with them, I think we'll probably be fine. And I'm willing to be patient. If we turn to this issue 5 years from now and we actually turn to it, that's okay. If we turn to it 5 years from now and ignore it. And I guess the last thing I'd say is I don't think Washington gets deficits and debts 100% optimal. Fiscal policy is not like the way I would tell people to do it. But it's not really, really quite as far off as you might think. When deficits and debt were a problem, it actually was a bigger issue in the 80s and 90s. I think George W. Bush spent more than he should have in 2001, but not like crazy more than he should have given the surplus we have then. Not worrying about debt and deficit 5 years ago, with interest rates where they were, I don't think that was crazy. I think people, as interest rates rise, are going to actually start worrying more. It is going to put more pressure on the political system. And so people will sort of stumble maybe to the right place, maybe a little bit imperfectly, a little bit after they should have, but, hopefully not terrible.
You don't sound terribly worried about the simple fact of having to refinance or finance new debt at much higher interest rates than anyone's been used to for the last decade.
Yes, exactly right. It's much higher interest rates than the last decade, but it's interest rates that 25 years ago would have been, we would have been perfectly thrilled to have the interest rates we have now. So I think it should make our concerns go up a little bit. But, and also on the deficit, people never want to talk about any of the good news. Health spending is way below any forecast that was made at any time in the last 15 years. And, a lot of other spending, not counting interest as a share of GDP, is also lower than we would have thought. So, there are different things moving in different directions. I think, I do think we're on an unsustainable course. The question is, how urgent an issue is that unsustainable course? And I'm willing to be a little bit patient, but, I may regret that.
A couple of final points. You mentioned in passing the crazy low interest rates, which looked kind of crazy to me just because it didn't seem sustainable. And I suppose, but I guess maybe it wasn't crazy while it existed. But how much of what we're dealing with now is an overhang from that? And how much do you think people also haven't especially younger people perhaps who just grew up in that environment, don't fully understand kind of the reality of interest rates, or that this was sort of a weird interlude, or maybe it wasn't a weird interlude. Maybe it was reasonable given the financial crisis.
Right. So there's two sort of interpretations of the low interest rates. One is that they were manufactured by the central banks and they created them and foisted them on us. That's popular in financial circles and in some popular circles. That's not what most economists think. Most economists think interest rates were actually falling even before the financial crisis. Interest rates were still quite low in 2019, a decade after the financial crisis, that despite these low interest rates, we didn't have a lot of inflation. And so there actually was a structural shift in the economy. High-income households saving more, China saving more, businesses need to borrow less to finance their big capital expenditures and the like. And all of those structural changes are still with us. And so, yes, I think in any given year, the Fed can sort of make interest rates lower or higher than what they naturally would be, but they still have to operate within some underlying structural paradigm. And so I think it was not that the central banks were nutty that we had low interest rates for so long. I think it was that we had a shift in the structure of our economy. Now, how much of that will last? I think a decent amount of it will last. I think we're going to come out of this with higher underlying, natural, neutral, structural, whatever you want to call it, interest rates than we had in 2019, but still lower than we had in, 2000, in the year 2000 or something like that. But that's another, if you told me any economic variable, I'd want to know productivity. The second one I'd probably know is what would the real interest rate be over the next 20 years, because it really does affect a lot of what we've been talking about in terms of, how worried we should be about the debt, for example, and a range of other issues.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So productivity and interest rates. Yeah, I think people like me are probably too much the other way of sort of assuming that what we grew up with is natural. So there has to be, and therefore there was sort of kookiness for the last 12 years, as if there weren't underlying, as you say, factors that might have made this reasonable for a while. And the truth is, or the future is somewhere in between the two, presumably the experiences of the two different eras, I guess.
Yeah, and that's also part of it, is people got... I've studied interest rate forecasts and how they've evolved over time. And for 20 years, people made errors all in the same direction. They kept over-predicting interest rates. They kept coming in below forecast. And part of that was that people kept thinking that the 1980s were relevant in thinking about interest rates. And the 1980s were just a freakish, weird period in our economic history. It's almost like you should have ignored it and not included it at all in your model for interest rates going forward. And the fact that people kept doing it meant they kept, being surprised when interest rates came in below what they said. So yeah, I think it wasn't all the good old days back then.
Never is. The next year and a half, just a short, medium term, I guess, year and a half. Is that what that is? What should people look for to know? I mean, are we heading to a soft landing, a good hard landing, incomplete and botched hard landing, not so soft, sort of soft landing? I mean, what data? What should just normal people out here be focusing on in terms of all this masses of data that comes out from the government and from surveys? And
I mean, if you're a completely normal person, you probably just want to look at the inflation rate and look at the version that strips out food and energy, which is called core inflation, and you want to look at the unemployment rate. Those two variables get you pretty far. If you want to be a little bit more sophisticated,
what would you want to see? What would cheer you up a year from now?
If we continue to see if we see core inflation rates falling, and if they're around 3, I think the Fed can sort of rest and feel like it's done its job. If they're much above 3.5, I think the Fed can't rest. In terms of the unemployment rate, if the unemployment rate stays below 4.5%, that is perfectly fine. Look, I'd rather have 3.5 than 4.5. But let's go back to the good old days comparisons we were doing before. 4.5% is would be a perfectly good thing if that was enough to solve our problems.
And if inflation just keeps going as kind of what it is, which is what, 5-6 range kind of?
Yeah.
That would be worrisome, and that would be unsustainable and would forecast
Exactly.
Right.
I mean, again, if you could guarantee me the inflation rate would be exactly 5.0 every year for the rest of time, that would be fine. But when you have 5% inflation, it tends not to come with a guarantee that it's going to stay at exactly that for the rest of time.
I saw a poll this morning. Public was asked, what do you expect your own financial situation to be a year from now? I have no idea if that's historically been at all a good predictor of the actual financial situation of either the public or the country as a whole, so to speak. But historically, people are obviously can be wildly pessimistic or optimistic and so forth. But it was sort of interesting. It was 28% think it'll be better, 28% the same, and 40% a little worse. And actually, I would say that seems pretty close to your kind of probabilistic sense of where we are. Am I right about that?
Turns out rational expectations was a good model of how people operate in the economy.
Yeah, so that's kind of where you are, right?
Exactly. That sounds about right.
Worried, but not, yeah. That's so interesting and so good to have a dose of realism, but also not of just realism in the sense of debunking, but actual thinking things through and seeing the trade-offs. Anything we've missed, Jason? Any final words for people to think about it there that we've totally...
No, I mean, I think the most important...
Can they watch your... Can they get Ec 10 kind of online without being hard?
We're doing an online version now, so at some point, I don't know if it'll be later this year, you'll be able to get the macro portion of the course online for free. Whole world will be able to watch what our students get, for better or for worse. But I think just trying to think in a sort of probabilistic way, with probabilities ideally that add up to 1 for all the different possibilities you think that they have, and to recognize, a certain amount of humility in the face of everything we're dealing with now, is important. But but then you can't be paralyzed by that humility. You still need to have, here's your best guess, here's how you're going to proceed. If all you ever do is say, we don't know, that's not that useful. It's sort of, here's my best guess, here's how it might be wrong, here's how I'll adjust if it is wrong.
That's an excellent note to end on. Jason, thank you very much for joining me today. And thank you all for joining us on Conversations.
Thank you.